399 BCE, an old man in Athens spent his final afternoon talking with his friends, then took a cup of poison from the hand of a public official and drank it himself. He kept talking as his legs went numb. When the cold reached his chest, he died, more or less mid-sentence, surrounded by students who had been arguing with him about the soul. Somewhere in that same broad span of centuries, on a road leading into a city east of the Tigris, another man condemned by another state was fixed alive to a tall wooden stake beside the road and left there. Not hidden. Placed. Every merchant, every traveler, every farmer hauling goods to market had to pass him on the way in. 2 men, 2 governments, both killed on the orders of the state. One death was nearly quiet and put the cup in the condemned man's own hand. The other was as loud and as public as a government could make it, and was built to be looked at for days. The difference wasn't the crime. The difference was that each state was saying something. About law, about power, about what a human body is good for once the law's finished with it. In the ancient world, the way you were killed was rarely an afterthought. It was the message. And if you want to know what an empire actually believed, one of the sharpest places to look is the way it killed the people it had decided to be rid of. The first empire to write its executions down in careful detail carved them onto a slab of black stone over 7 feet tall. We call it the Code of Hammurabi, after the Babylonian king who issued it around 1754 BCE. And it lists something close to 282 laws, a good number of which end in a death. What makes it worth a close look isn't the count, it's the logic. Babylonian execution ran on a kind of grim symmetry, the principle most people know as an eye for an eye. The punishment was built to mirror the crime, sometimes with unsettling precision. If a builder put up a house so badly that it collapsed and killed the owner, the builder was put to death. If the collapse killed the owner's son, then it was the builder's son who was killed instead. The math had to balance. The method, too, was chosen to match. Burn down a man's property and a court could have you burned. A looter caught stealing at a house fire was to be thrown into that same fire. A wife caught with another man could be bound to him and thrown into the water to drown, though the king or the wronged husband could choose to spare them. You didn't wait around to learn how you'd die. If you knew the crime, you already knew the method. Then there was the strangest piece of the system, and the one that tells you the most about how Babylon understood justice. For accusations that couldn't be settled by witnesses, sorcery, certain charges of adultery, the case was handed to the river. The accused was thrown into the Euphrates. If the water dragged them under, they were guilty, and they were also, conveniently, already dead. If they came back out alive, they were innocent, and the person who had accused them could be executed in their place. This was the river ordeal, and it wasn't treated as a coin toss. The river was a god who could see what mortal judges could not. Handing a man to the water wasn't giving up on justice. It was appealing to a higher court, one that delivered the verdict and carried out the sentence in a single motion. Babylon's whole system rested on the belief that justice was part of the structure of the universe, mathematical and divine, and that when men couldn't measure it, a god in the shape of a river would. The river didn't ask for evidence. It only asked for a body. Babylon wrote its deaths down in exhaustive detail. Egypt did almost the reverse. It executed remarkably few people, kept quiet about the ones it did, and saved its most frightening punishment for a target the Babylonians never thought to aim at: the next life. Egypt had a death penalty. Impalement is attested, so is burning, so is beheading. But it was used sparingly, especially on ordinary people, and the gravest cases needed the pharaoh's direct sign-off, because the pharaoh was the living guarantee of Ma'at, the Egyptian idea of cosmic order and truth that the whole society existed to hold up. Most lawbreakers faced beatings, forced labor, exile, or mutilation long before they faced death. Killing a person disturbed the order of things, and that was not done lightly. What an Egyptian truly feared wasn't the executioner. It was what came after him. To an Egyptian, death was a doorway, not a wall. The soul went on. The name was part of the soul, and the body had to be preserved and buried with the correct rites to make the crossing. So the worst thing a state could do to you wasn't to end your life, it was to wreck your eternity, to deny you burial, to bury you wrong, to scratch your name off every surface until, as far as the universe was concerned, you had simply never existed. There's a real case, and we have the paperwork. Near the end of the reign of Ramesses III, around 1155 BCE, a faction inside the royal harem plotted to murder him. The ringleader was a secondary wife named Tie, who wanted her son Pentuer, on the throne in place of the rightful heir. The plot was exposed, and the trial records survive on a document we call the Judicial Papyrus of Turin. The sentences map the whole Egyptian hierarchy onto death. Lower conspirators were executed outright. Several judges who had been corrupted during the trial itself had their noses and ears cut off. But the high-status plotters, Pentuer among them, were not handed to an executioner at all. They were permitted to take their own lives, a final courtesy that spared them the indignity of dying by a stranger's hand. For a long time, nobody knew whether the plot had worked. Then, in 2012, a CT scan of the mummy of Ramesses III found a deep cut across the throat, hidden beneath the bandages, almost certainly the wound that killed him. The conspiracy had succeeded. The king was murdered. And there is a stranger body still. Among the royal mummies lies an unidentified young man, wrapped in a ritually unclean goat skin, his face twisted into what looks like a scream, never given a proper burial. DNA has tied him to Ramesses III. Many Egyptologists think he is Pentuer, and that his sentence wasn't only death. It was the wrong death, the wrong wrapping, the rites withheld. Egypt didn't just want him gone, it wanted him locked out of forever. Egypt hid its executions and aimed them at the soul. The empire that came to dominate the same world a few centuries later did the precise opposite. It made its executions as loud as it possibly could, then carved them into the walls of its palaces so no one could claim they hadn't seen. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, at its height between roughly 911 and 609 BCE, ran the most feared army of its age, and it grasped something we'd now file under public relations. The Assyrian kings did not simply kill the people who defied them, they publicized it. They wrote up their punishments in the first person in their royal annals, and they lined the great stone halls of their palaces with carved scenes of it. Ashur-Nasirpal II, Ashur-Nasirpal, who ruled from 883 to 859 BCE, left inscriptions in which he personally boasts of flaying rebel leaders alive and draping their skins over the walls of their own cities, of stacking heaps of severed heads, of impaling the survivors around captured towns. No enemy is accusing him of this. He is bragging in his own official record, presenting it as proof of what a strong king he was. You can still see the other half of the message, the reliefs that lined the palaces at Nimrud and Nineveh, many of them now in the British Museum, show the machinery of Assyrian conquest in patient detail, including rows of prisoners impaled outside a fallen city. The most famous set depicts the siege of Lachish, in 701 BCE under Sennacherib, and it does not look away from what was done to the defenders who were made examples of. Foreign envoys visiting the court walked past these walls on their way to meet the king. The building itself was a threat. Now, historians are right to be cautious. Royal inscriptions are propaganda. A king cataloguing his own atrocities is trying to sound terrifying, and the figures may be inflated. But that caution sharpens the point rather than dulling it. The exact body count was never the product. The fear was. This was deterrence by broadcast. A city weighing whether to resist Assyria didn't have to guess what losing would cost. It had already heard the stories, and the stories were the strategy. The man nailed up outside the gate wasn't the audience. He was the advertisement, addressed to everyone still alive and still deciding. For most states, the killing was the point, and whoever happened to witness it was incidental. For Assyria, the watching was the point, and the condemned man was just the surface it was printed on. The empire that swallowed Assyria's world and grew far larger took that idea of execution as display and made it more intimate. Persia didn't need a whole conquered city for its theater. A single condemned man and a watching court would do. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, Ukhemu-Nid, which ran from 550 to 330 BCE, was the largest the world had yet seen, and the way it killed was designed to prove one thing again and again, that the king's power over a human life was complete, and that he could take as long as he pleased exercising it. For the documented version, we have the king's own words. High on a cliff at Behistun, Behistun, in western Iran, Darius I carved an enormous inscription describing how he seized the throne and crushed the revolts that followed. It is a monument to himself, in his own voice, and in it he calmly records what he did to the rebel leaders he captured. One pretender named Fravartish, he describes mutilating, the nose and ears and tongue cut away, an eye put out, then chained at the palace gate where everyone could see him, and finally impaled. This is not a hostile rumor. It is the official royal account, the version Darius wanted, cut into rock forever. The Greek historian Herodotus adds more of the same from the other side, claiming that after Thermopylae the Persians beheaded the dead Spartan king Leonidas and fixed his body to a stake. Then there's the version Persia's enemies told, and here we have to slow down. The Greek writer Plutarch, drawing on an older source, describes a Persian execution so elaborate it earned its own name, Scaphism. Scaph is from the Greek word for boat. In his account, the condemned man was sealed between two hollowed-out troughs, force-fed milk and honey until he sickened, smeared with more honey, and left floating on stagnant water in the sun to be eaten alive by insects over many days. It is a memorable horror. It is also almost certainly not reliable history. The story comes from Greek writers who despised Persia, set down centuries after the fact, and most historians treat Scaphism as exaggeration or pure invention, a tale built to make the Persians look like monsters. But look at what the story reaches for, if invention is what it is. It pictures a death that takes days, administered slowly and on purpose, the killing stretched into a long demonstration, which is exactly the thing Darius really did carve into the cliff. The mutilated rebel kept alive at the gate, the stake saved for last. Whether or not the boats ever existed, the slander worked on its audience because it fits something true about how Persian power liked to present itself. Darius set that record into a cliff face so high and remote that almost no one would be able to read it for the next 2,000 years. He carved it anyway. He wanted the executions on the permanent record, not as a confession, but as a boast. Persia built its theater around the absolute power of one man. Directly across the Aegean, a scatter of small Greek city-states was running on the opposite idea. A good many of them had no king at all, and their most famous form of execution did something none of the great monarchies would have thought to do. It put the cup in the condemned man's own hand and asked him to drink. That old man from the very start of this video, the one still talking as the cold climbed his legs, was Socrates. In one of the proudest democracies the Greek world produced, he was tried before a jury of hundreds of ordinary Athenian citizens, found guilty of impiety and of corrupting the young, and sentenced to die by hemlock, a poison the city kept ready for exactly this purpose. The account comes from his student Plato, who has him spend his last hours calmly debating whether the soul outlives the body, then take the cup without ceremony and lie down to let it do its work. It's tempting to read that scene as proof Athens executed gently. It didn't, particularly. The hemlock death was something closer to the civilized citizen's edition ending. The same city also used apotympanismos, clamping a man to a wooden board with iron collars and leaving him fixed there in the open to die by inches. And Athens kept a pit called the Barathron, a rocky cleft into which criminals and the corpses of the executed were simply tipped. So the cup was not mercy as a policy. It was a privilege of standing, the death you are given if you were a citizen rather than a condemned slave or a foreigner. What the hemlock really shows is how Athens liked to picture itself. A citizen was a self-governing creature, an active part of the running of the state, and the city stretched that idea right up to the edge of death. It would not have a public slave throttle a citizen like livestock. It set the cup down in front of him and trusted him to lift it. The killing belonged to the city. The final motion belonged to him. They had condemned the most stubbornly independent mind in Athens, and then expected him to put himself to death independently, like a gentleman. He obliged. The Greeks argued about the soul in the open air. Far to the east, an empire was setting its punishments down in a very different kind of document. Not a monument, not a law carved for the public to admire, but a private handbook on how to seize a state and keep it. The Mauryan Empire, founded around 322 BCE, was the first to draw most of the Indian subcontinent under a single throne. Its founding strategist, a man traditionally called Kautilya, is credited with a treatise named the Arthashastra, roughly, the science of statecraft. It is a cold, brilliant, intensely practical book about taxes, spies, farming, war, and the handling of human beings, and it treats punishment as one more lever of administration. Its organizing idea is dunda, the rod. Kautilya argues that it is the threat of punishment, and nothing gentler, that holds a society together. Take away the rod, and the strong simply eat the weak. So the book lays out penalties with an accountant's precision. Fines for small offenses, mutilations for worse, death for the worst, every one of them scaled to the rank of the offender and the gravity of the act. Execution appears in several forms here, from quick killings to slow ones, each slotted to its category of crime. This isn't divine symmetry or carved terror. It's policy. It's a line item. And then the Mauryan story does the one thing no other empire on this list managed. 2 generations on, the throne passed to the founder's grandson, Ashoka. Early in his reign, he was a conqueror in the family mold, and around 261 BCE, he took the eastern kingdom of Kulinga, in a war so ruinous that his own later inscriptions put the dead in the hundreds of thousands. By his own account, the scale of it broke something in him. Ashoka spent the rest of his reign covering his empire in carved edicts on rocks and on pillars, expressing remorse, urging non-violence, and pulling the state back from cruelty. He did not abolish the death penalty. But in one of those pillar edicts, he granted every condemned prisoner a respite of 3 days before execution, a small window to settle their affairs and make their peace. The empire that had reduced killing to a line in a manual produced, within 3 generations, the most powerful man in the ancient world, publicly wishing he could set the rod down. He couldn't, quite, but he is the only ruler here who tried. Where Ashoka spent his reign trying to loosen the rod, an empire taking shape at almost the same moment on the far side of the mountains, was gripping it as hard as a state possibly could. The Qin built itself on the conviction that the law should be merciless, absolute, and far larger than any single human life. The philosophy was legalism, and its great practical architect was a statesman named Shangyang, who in the 4th century BCE rebuilt the state of Qin around strict laws and savage penalties. The legalists held that people obey only reward and punishment, that the law must fall on everyone without exception, and that above all it must be feared. Chin punishment ran from branding and the cutting away of noses and feet up through a full catalogue of executions. Beheading, cutting a man in two at the waist, boiling, being torn apart between chariots. The piece that truly defined the system, though, was collective punishment. For the gravest crimes, the law did not stop at the guilty man. It reached out and took his family with him, parents, brothers, children, in the worst cases, 3 sets of relatives executed together. The reasoning was total deterrence. Make every one of a man's relatives a hostage too. His behavior and rebellion becomes almost unthinkable. The individual counted for nothing. The bloodline was the unit the law actually worked on. One quick correction, since it always comes up. The punishment most people picture when they think of imperial China, death by slow 1,000 cuts, belongs to a far later age, more than 1,000 years after the Qin. The early empire's cruelty was blunter than that, and more sweeping. Which brings us to the most fitting death in this entire video. When Shang Yang's royal patron died, his enemies at court moved against him, and the great lawmaker tried to run. The story, recorded by the historian Sima Qian, is that he stopped at an inn and was turned away. Because under Shang Yang's own law, an innkeeper who sheltered a man without proper papers shared in that man's punishment. The architect of the system could not find a single safe room inside it. He was caught and executed by being torn apart between chariots, and his family was wiped out under the very collective punishment law he himself had written. He had spent his life making the law bigger than any man. He simply hadn't expected to be one of the men. Every empire so far sorted its executions by something. By the crime, by the state of the soul, by the size of the watching crowd, by the reach of a man's bloodline. Rome sorted death by a question it asked before the trial had even begun. Not what did you do? Who are you? Roman execution was openly, unapologetically graded by status, and the Romans saw nothing strange in that at all. The great dividing line was citizenship, and by the imperial age the law had hardened a further split between the honest yours, honesteor eyes, the respectable upper classes, and the humiliores, humilior eyes, the lowly. Your category decided which deaths were even available to you. A Roman citizen had protections. He was usually spared the slow and humiliating methods. A condemned citizen could expect the sword, beheading, quick and clean by the standards of the day. And an aristocrat ordered to die was often allowed the dignity of doing it himself, opening his veins in a warm bath, the way the philosopher Seneca did when the Emperor Nero turned on him. The man still died. The point was that his standing survived the dying. For the slave, the foreigner, and the rebel, Rome kept a harsher inventory. The most notorious item was crucifixion, which the Romans themselves called the servile supplicium, the slave's punishment. It was slow, it was public, and above all it was shameful, a death engineered to brand the body on it as the lowest kind of human there was. When the slave revolt led by Spartacus collapsed in 71 BCE, the general Crassus had some 6,000 captured rebels crucified along the road from Capua toward Rome. Miles of dying men, much as Assyria had once lined its roads. Except now, the method itself announced that these were not people whose deaths were owed any dignity at all. There was also damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, in which the convicted were sent out before a paying arena crowd to be torn apart by lions or bears. A man could be executed and serve as the afternoon's entertainment in a single motion. And then there was the strangest sentence Rome ever kept on its books, reserved for one crime above all others, killing your own father or close blood kin. It was called the poena culae, piena culae, the penalty of the sack. The condemned was sewn up inside a large leather sack and thrown into a river or the sea to drown. In the fuller versions handed down in Roman legal texts, he did not go in alone. He was sealed in alongside live animals, a dog, a rooster, a snake, and an ape, left to thrash against him in the dark as the sack went under. Strange as it sounds, the logic fit a Roman mind exactly. A man who murdered his own father had broken nature so completely that he could not be permitted to touch any part of it. Not the earth, so he could not be buried in it. Not the open air, so his head was hooded. Not even clean water, which he would only pollute. He was bundled out of the natural world altogether, in the company of beasts, because he had already conducted himself as something less than a man. This is where the whole pattern shows its hand. In Rome, the manner of your death was your social rank made physical. Two men could commit the identical crime and die in completely different ways. One beheaded as a citizen, one nailed to a cross as a slave. And Rome felt no contradiction in it, because the sentence was never only about the act. It was a verdict on who you had always been. The body on the cross was being killed, yes. It was also being told, in front of everyone, precisely what the city had always thought it was worth. There is one last twist, and it closes the circle on the whole idea. The most degrading execution Rome possessed? The cross, the slave's death, the punishment saved for the very lowest, was the one a condemned man in a Roman province was nailed to in the 1st century, and which his followers then carried off and set at the center of the largest religion the world would ever see. Within a few centuries, the Emperor Constantine, the first Christian to rule Rome, abolished crucifixion across the empire out of reverence for that single death. The punishment built to mean worthlessness had been turned, all the way over, into a symbol of the divine, which is the thread running under every empire we've walked through. The river that judged for Babylon, the burial Egypt withheld, the boasts Assyria carved into its walls, the cliff Darius left in Persia, the cup Athens handed Socrates, the respite Ashoka granted, the bloodline the Chin destroyed, the cross Rome saved for its slaves. Killing was the easy part. What each of these societies was really doing was using the body of a condemned man to spell out, in the most permanent ink it had, what it believed a human being actually was. Change the method, and you change the message. And sometimes, given enough centuries, the message changes all on its own. If you want more like this, click the video on your screen now.